Hey everyone, Fury back again with another podcast episode for the Total Podcast Idiots. As you probably noticed, I've got a 2021 Division 3 tournament page pulled up and a whole bunch of teams already listed on the side there. What I thought I'd do is I thought I'd go through and give you kind of the lowdown as far as where the TPI stand, who I think has the best chance at a top 8. And then we're going to kind of parlay this into a discussion as to what it takes to be competitive and to escape Division 3 for Division 2. So again, going to go through the tournament and then we'll go into a little bit of a discussion as to what some of the teams that are escaping have done right and finish it off with probably a few common misconceptions that teams make when they first join the game and find themselves usually on one of these teams at this level. We're going to go ahead and go through all the teams that are ranked as the top seeds through the top 8. So this will go all the way down to the line with Detroit Mercy, Humboldt State, Santa Barbara, Glenville, Bowdoin, Indiana, GAC, and Middle Tennessee. So first off, let's take a look at Seattle Pacific. Looks like we have a bot manager here, and we'll note their TPI is currently sitting at a 129.5. So far, not looking like a crazy amount of talent at the top of the seeding for Division 3. And unfortunately, looks like this team is probably not going to be top 8 bound because I see a very significant injury. Major right. If we look at their TPI, and we can kind of scroll over to see what class they're in, it's a very, very experienced group on the spot team, but they really have made it based on their size and their talent inside. And while they have Weber and Shell and Wall still as a decent threat of tall players inside, that loss of that 144 SI power forward, especially given that he is the best inside shooter on the team, makes me think that they're going to have a little bit of a struggle with the top 8 despite their good TPI and their good size. Let's see how well he played at this level. Actually, all things considered, his shooting has not been that great. If you look the year before, he had more of what I would expect from a power forward of this kind of quality with that 59.5 versus the 49.5 this season. I'm not exactly sure what's changed here. It doesn't look like the bot has changed too much as far as how he is managed. Looks like he still has the same level on the shooting tendency, meaning he's not gone from, say, shoot few shots to shoot very often, as his field goal attempts have stayed very much the same. Also of note, if you look between the 2 years here, there's a 53.7 and a 46.6 on the opponent's field goal percentage. So he's lost a little bit of the field goal percentage margin lead that he had between the 2 seasons, but he plays better defense, and the team as a whole appears to be playing much better this season, given the crazy difference in plus minus between the 2 years. So maybe they will not feel the impact of him being out for basically the entirety of the postseason run, give or take. I think actually he would probably be cleared right around the time the finals hit, but I don't see a great chance of him making it all the way there. still, whoever gets them in the first round is probably not going to have a fun time just because they do have a lot of good veteran talent on their team. Taking a step back now, looks like we have Fitz JFC's team here, Towson Tigers. No injuries yet, but this is being done at the first round of conference games just to give you a little bit of time to see the video before we hit the tournament. Actually, we should go ahead and go back to see where he is at. 145.7. Now, this is a vastly different TPI, and I'm not sure if it's factored in the injury on the last page, but even still, if you look at the SIs amongst the top 5 or 6 players, in fact, their top 7 or 8 is actually more likely. You'll see that there's a bunch of 130 pluses going all the way up to 160s. They don't quite have the same height as the team before them, but I don't think it necessarily matters because, again, if you look at just how much SI they have put into these players, the majority of them are quite talented. It looks like one of them isn't even playing much given his positional ratings are all 0. And yet he still managed to get 136. So they're not even playing a guy that's in their top 8 in terms of total skill. So I think this would be the first team, barring significant injuries, that I would say is probably top 8 bound. The weakness appears to be that they don't have a lot of defensive depth, but I don't know that that would matter too much given that they have a good amount of shooting. So you'd have to basically find a way to stop them from scoring, 80 to 90 points. And let's take a look just quickly at their conference. Yeah, it looks like they're averaging closer to 80 plus points per game. And they also led their conference defensively, so maybe fouling is the way to go. Who knows? This team looks pretty destined for a top 8 finish now. All right, Canton Kangaroos. We have a TPI score of 141.9. So it immediately stands out again is the common theme for some of the top teams that we've seen so far here in Division Three's top seeds is that they all have a decent amount of not only SI across all positions, but most importantly, their size is at least on par with their SI ranking. Another example here of a team that has multiple bigs that are in the 6-8 plus range. And while the skill kind of tapers off on this team as far as the bigs go, they still have enough depth where you can't just foul out one of their bigs and suddenly be in the hundreds to 90s. Which, if we looked at promoting teams from my previous video, we did see a lot of teams that were promoting that really didn't have even this level of depth amongst their bigs, and those were the teams that were still making it up. But they were teams that were kind of fighting for that positioning. Back to Canton's roster here, though. I think that this is an example of where Canton's just going to have to dodge the foul trouble because of the lack of both defense and offense once you get kind of down on the depth chart. They got a much younger team than the first two teams. But their young talent is coming along nicely, so even if you get to the bench, it's not necessarily a situation where you're going to see them kind of flounder too much. So I would consider them reasonable for a top 8 position, but I don't know if they're going to quite get there. It just depends on the matchups they get along the way. And we'll see if anybody matches up with them and stymie their top 2 bigs. Specifically, I think Swafford's kind of the biggest threat inside, given his inside shooting is the highest. So that's it for Rats Fam's team. Let's see about Louisiana Tech. Looks like Zach has a 141.5 on his TPI score. And we have a handful of injuries here, but they're all 5-game injuries. And I do believe there's a gap of about a week between the first round of games in the conference and the first game of the tournament. So both of these injuries should be out of the way in time. What's interesting about Louisiana Tech is this is kind of the first team that doesn't have size all around. They have 1 or 2 guys that are kind of in the 6'10" range, and they do have a 6'7.5" player that's sufficient enough to play. But without some sort of decent vertical or wingspan, let's see, Huston's is 6'7" and 1/4 for wingspan, and 27.5 vertical. Bundy's got a huge wingspan vertical, over 7 foot on the wing, and vertical's over 30, so definitely good there. And then another 7 foot wingspan with not quite the same vertical for Robinette, but yeah, so their starting lineup again looks to be strong. This is probably the weakest of the inside defenses for the team that we've seen so far. So it's another one of those teams that has proven itself to be a force in Division III on the back of its offensive credentials. So looking at the top 4, I think the first team that we think probably has a good chance is Towson, so we'll just go ahead and put a yes by them. And the other 3, we aren't quite sure yet if they can pull it off, so we'll go ahead and wait. Kalamazoo. Let's see what Todd has for his TPI, 144.1. So looks like for those looking to escape Division III that the high 130s to low 140s is where you should look to get to. At a glance, looks like a lot of these players will be returning, so they have a good chance to promote and then on top of that stay up, given that they'll have their top 4 returning. They're only losing a couple of their bigs, so if they can go out and recruit some, it should be fine. Anyways, that's not what we're here for. Let's look at them as a team. I see multiple guys on this team with good inside shooting. I see multiple guys on this team with great outside shooting. Several of the bigs have decent strength. There are a couple players that have kind of interesting builds for their heights that make them kind of hard to play in this lineup. But I think their starting 5 and even their 6th and 7th men should be quality enough to see this team through the first couple rounds. I would say, unlike some of the first couple of teams that we've analyzed, I think this team's weakness is not really in its defense or its depth chart so much as it is the speed that the team has in total. Some of the players that don't quite have the height to be bigs have speed that would be placed in that part of the court when you're on the offensive side. So a 6, a 7, and a 5 on a 6'4.5", 6'6", and a 6'7.5" isn't the best. I think Agula at 6'7.5" is probably fine with the 5 speed because you can play him inside, but a 6'6" is kind of fringe even for Division 3 to go inside with. And at small forward, I don't know that I could really stomach the 7 speed that easily. And certainly once you get to 6'4.5", you have some problems down there. So unless Marvin Jennings has a huge amount of wingspan vertical, and actually for his height, he has a decent wingspan, just over 6'7" on the wingspan, and his vertical is over 30. So plays a little bit bigger than his height, but I think that that's going to be a bit of a struggle to get through some of the better teams. So we'll see how they do. I don't think I would put them in the top 8 at this point, but they certainly could sneak in should they find their way into some matchups with teams that don't quite have the best lamp to take advantage of their speed issues. Hockey Tier B, Pittsburgh Panthers, and they are at 146.7, so they're the highest that we've seen so far on the TPI level. They do have a 170 leading their team, and they have a lot of talent at the guard level. And I mean a lot. So their depth as far as the point guard through small forward positions is all 153 to 170, and they can 5-man rotation that and be fine at all 3 positions. So there's no way for you to really take advantage of that team as far as fouling somebody out on the perimeter. Where they don't quite have the same level of talent as inside. I mean, if you're really looking at height as an indicator of whether or not you should play somebody inside, they have a redshirt junior, Carson Hudson, and then they have a true freshman and a redshirt freshman as kind of the guys that should go into that place on the court. Scotty Whaley could, in theory, cover some, but at 6'6.5" and a wingspan that actually isn't too bad, 6'11", and a vertical at 30.5", so he may play a little bit better. But would you want to play him if you were going into the national tournament, even in Division 3? I don't know that his talent's really that good. It's basically all single digits. He will be faster than several bigs that get played in this tournament, though. So Pittsburgh is going to probably have to play some sort of defense that kind of eliminates the chances for the bigs to get as many fouls drawn against them, or I don't know. I really don't know how they would be able to survive if they lost one or both of their 120s bigs. Maybe they would play some guard height players and just hope that the inside defense on, say, a Russ Rowland would be enough to overcome the fact that he's not quite the big height. In fact, he's not even close. So I would have major reservations about putting Pittsburgh in a top 8 situation. I think they could take care of business in the first round, but then starting in the second round, especially the third round, the Sweet 16, they'll probably find somebody in those first 3 teams that has the size advantage over them. All right, Alabama A&M. Jedi Alex has a new team power index high of 155.7. It's going to take some really big size issues for me to not declare this team capable of making it there. Let's see. I mean, they don't have the most amazing heights for their bigs, but their top 4 guys that could play down low are at 147, 143, 142, and 139. So when you compare them to the last team directly, where we have guys in the 120s getting considered, I think it's pretty clear to see what team would probably be better off inside. They have good inside depth, they have good outside depth. They have a little bit of a speed problem amongst a handful of their players, but there are other players on the team that have plenty of speed, so I don't know that team speed is necessarily the best, but not enough to really cripple them either. If you look at inside defenses, perimeter defenses, you see some inside defensive valuations of 15s. It looks like even their small forward, their best bet there, would have an 11. And then multiple double digit guards. So I think the only place that I can see personally that they would be the weakest at would be rebounding. But is that enough of a hole to stop them from being able to achieve what would be considered a top 8 finish? Kind of doubting it at this point. I think this is the second team that we can definitely lock in as a team that I would pick to go top 8. All right. St. Olaf College, making it there without the assistance of a human at the helm, and a TPI of 138. So a handful of bots up there coming in with lower TPI scores but better coaching, putting the human ranks to shame. At first glance, I think the biggest issue that we'll see is a lack of defense, especially once you start breaking through the starting lineup and into the reserves a little bit, whether or not it's via fouling or just by rotating through and substitute situations. And the other issue they have is their depth chart really isn't that, for lack of a better word, deep. It just doesn't have the talent once you get to that second level of players that are going to come into the game and play somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes, depending on foul issues, to match up with some of the better teams. So, right away, top 8 issues for me as far as declaring this team able to get there. While they don't have great defense, they certainly have very good team speed. I mean, they have a single digit at center, but the other 4 starting positions, the lowest is a 12. They have good strength at both the undersized power forward position and the small forward position. And the center certainly has it. Doesn't look like they have the best basket penetration and or fast tempo play. So I think they just sit there and go for the let's shoot efficiently and hope that we don't have to get an offensive rebound because we don't have great rebounding. And then defensively, I think they just rely on out muscling and being faster as opposed to being smarter. So you can see how a computer could take this team and be in one of the top 2 seeds. But you also see a lot of weaknesses there as far as their talent across their players. So definitely a chance for the humans to take one back there once we get into that tournament. Next up is Dave and the Buffalo Bulls. Not to be confused with the Buffalo Bills. Quite an interesting team at the top here. They have enough height at both the power forward and small forward position to be a threat there. Though defensively, I'm not sure their small forward is quite that good. He certainly looks it offensively. And I'm guessing they're using Hurley at 7'1.5" as their starter, just to try and get the mismatch, because especially in conference play, you're going to find a lot of teams don't have any size. So having anyone the 6'11", 7', 7'1" range is enough to just cause massive problems, even if you're at a skill disadvantage of 20 or 30. If they run up against a 6'11" or 6'10.5", or even a 6'10", that's got 30 or 40 SI on them, of course they're not going to be able to compete as well there. But if you're running into 6'6" or 6'7", you've got 5 or 6 inches on those guys. That's where I think that the size advantage really comes into play. And if you look down at their true freshman, it's got the wingspan almost at 7'8". It's very close to it. So some interesting mismatches down there. As far as weaknesses that we might see hurt them, I think it's again a situation where once you get out of the top one big on inside defense and the top 2 or 3 guys on perimeter defense, you really have nothing left defensively. So it's another team that's going to go out there and be really, really fast offensively to get to 80 points. But after that, I don't know that their opponent's going to be too far behind them. You know what I'm saying there? MSU Moorhead. Looks like we have 144. So let's see. Another team that doesn't really have the greatest depth charts as far as their bigs go. And this is one of those teams where you could probably see them struggling against 7-footers. But if you don't have that size advantage to go against Decker and Rogers, then they have the skill set to be able to go ahead and wipe out anyone, say, in the 6'8", 6'9", 6'10" range. Especially at 170. I don't think there are too many power forwards or centers in the lower ranks that have that sort of skill index. And it's not just the fluff areas that Decker has them in. I mean, he's got a 15 strength and a 15 inside shot. Still has double-digit inside defense. The only thing that he lacks for a big is rebounding. But it looks like it's team rebounding that kind of makes up the difference there, given that there are several other starters that are in that double-digit range. So what we have here is another team that's kind of throwing caution to the wind as far as the defensive side of the ball and making sure that they can outscore you as their primary threat. Not sure that I can put them in the top 8 so easily. But you can see why they're at least in the discussion for a 3 seed. Another bot team coming up with their skin. Let's see, 137.8. We have another bot that has recruited enough size. Their top 3, as far as the guys that are in their correct size range, have heights of 6'8", 6'10.5", and 7'1". All 3 above the 120 range. And while they're not all 3 great in every single big category, they at least do some of the things right. So while Khan, for example, doesn't have a double-digit inside defense or interior defense, he has quite good rebounding and quite good inside shooting. And I'm hovering over him just to look at his wingspan and vertical, and they're both decent. They're not amazing. Wingspan being only 7'3" on his height and a vertical of 30 isn't great, but it's not bad either, so not detrimental. I'm not sure how this team could really get to the top eight, though. Just looking across the board, I'm looking for a lot of double digits in the shooting department, and I see a handful, but it's kind of more sporadic in comparison to some of the teams we've looked at so far. Defensively, again, they have a few guys that can defend pretty well, but it's kind of sporadic again. It looks like they're dominating from the uh, right column stats. And by right column, I mean the stats that are literally when you go to the player page on the right. This player is not the best example, but if you look at somebody that's going to play minutes, I guess that's not even the case. So let's see where they're getting all these points. Lots of guys that can pass and handle good. Lots of guys with high speed. Their worst speed on the team is a 7. At a position that can't really afford to be at that level. But then they have all guys in like 11s and 12s for their bigs. They have the guards sitting at 13s and 14s and 16s. Another big height player with a 17 speed. So it looks like they just have a lot of passing and speed to get their SI, which means they're going to be pretty good at distribution and pretty good at getting away from matchups against slower teams. So it looks like this is one of those teams that has just blazed past some of the other teams at their level. I think it's a conference giant, but I don't think it's a tournament giant. Northwestern St. Paul, another bot team here, 136.4. Seems like any team that's a bot doesn't have the TPI, but has made it there against the odds. So far, of the bot teams I've looked at, this is the team that's most likely to make the top 8 if we have one go there this year. And the reason why is they have a 6'7" power forward that's a little bit undersized and a 6'11" center, but both have great inside defense. And the guy I would put in as kind of the third big is sitting at 6'8" and nearly a 120 for the skill index. So their top 3 in that rotation isn't too bad. And on the guard side, they still have a good handful of players that are right at the lower end of the double digits. For outside shooting, they have a good complement there. For inside shooting, they have a good complement. And while this team isn't fast across the board, their team speed is by no means slow, given that their top 5 skill indexes are all at 9 or above. So not seeing a ton of weaknesses in the top 5, and if they don't foul out, I actually think I would be closer to declaring this team top 8 worthy. The only thing that holds me back is that once you get one guy out, especially if you get a big out early here, I think you're looking at a situation where they're going to have to substitute in next best option, and that next best option could be someone like, oh, I don't even know. Would this team go down to Miller? No. I think they'd end up kind of putting in 6'4". It's really once you get past Applegate Weeks, And Connor, there really isn't another good height guy outside of Bolton. But it looks like he's starting, so I think inside depth is probably the worst spot for them. Guard depth is fine. Team SI depth is also fine. Only one guy in their top 8 or 9 that would be kind of unplayable. That's for me. That's Love, just because his speed isn't there. But you could play him as an undersized small forward, and maybe he could get there for you. So just gonna go back and kind of some way to star this up so I can keep track of things. So start up 3 teams that I think could maybe slip into the conversation. Rutgers, the next bot team up for bids, is 135.9. At a glance, it looks like they have a decent enough rotation between their seniors that are down on the depth chart and their seniors that are at the top to make it happen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seniors. In terms of defense, they have 5 perimeter defenders that are in double digits and 3 interior defenders that are pretty good. It's more of a rebounding by committee team. And nobody on their team has speed so bad that they can't play guard. Grant would be the closest, but he's clearly not going to play guard anyways. So I guess Ritter would be the only one that's going to be single digits on speed. If I were to pick a weakness, I suppose, not that this team is terribly weak at any one area, but I would guess that they're going to be most hindered by the fact that their best rebounders, for the most part, are some of their smaller players. The 3 players with the best height have a 12, a 9, and a 9. The 4th one in on that equation has an 8. You would have to play an undersized Hendricks to really get a 3rd double-digit rebounder down low. And it looks like they almost have defaulted to using Brady as a big just because his rebounding is one of the only ones that has it in like the 11 or 12 range. But 6'4.5", even with a good wingspan or vertical, it looks like a 7-foot wingspan and a 28-inch vertical. I don't know that he's got enough height to really match up well with guys once we get to 6'10", 6'11 range. So I'm not really compelled to put them in the top. The Grand Wizard has the Auburn Tigers, 141.9. Auburn's bigs don't necessarily have the greatest of SI totals, but what I do like about them is they have good builds for bigs. So across Reinhardt, I would say Strickland would be a qualified big. And Hayes, they have good rebounding and good inside defense for 2 of them. And the 3rd one at least has the good inside shooting. So even though he doesn't rebound too well, Hayes should, between his shooting and his defense, put a good margin up there. I guess his downfall might be his strength at single digit 5, and Reinhardt's being at 5 as well doesn't help. And then once you get past those three, you're in a situation where your best bet is somebody probably already starting your top five. I'm actually most concerned about the perimeter defense, though, on this team because outside of Richardson, I only see an 11 on probably their sixth best guard or small forward. And then Leon Brown's the only other one that's really start five, top five capable defensively. Otherwise, they have good speed. They have good shooting on the guards. So I don't know if this will be an easy team to play against, but at the same time, it's probably one of those teams that's fringe to make the top eight, and I would lean towards no. Clarkson, Omar has them. TPI, before I leave that page, is 137.1. So they have a couple of decent looking bigs that are underclassmen. They have DeMarco Brown at 7'1", Sean Tatum at 6'8.5". That'll both be there for a handful of years to come. They have Campbell and Winfield, Chauncey, or Causey, I should say, that have enough height to be sufficient for a power forward or center spot in Division 6. In terms of inside defense, you can see why Causey's playing small forward. He has such a low value there that he can't really play inside. But Winfield and Campbell certainly have the inside defense and the rebounding and the shooting. So this is one of those teams that's actually a little bit weaker on the guard side than it is on the big side. I think I'm comfortable enough right now, even at the lower SI totals, to declare them a team that's top 8 if I were to make a tournament bracket for this. Their team distribution's a little bit poor. That's one small weakness I see, because outside of Feldman, while they have decent passing on some of the other positions, their handling isn't sufficient enough to play that spot. Furthermore, their stamina on some of their players really isolates who should be getting starting minutes to Feldman, Fowler, and Causey for that outside tandem trio. Because once you get down into Carrera, you have a 6. Velasquez, 6. Looks like one player from Iceland has a 4, so he's pretty far down the depth chart, though. I guess he probably doesn't impact much. So a couple of stamina problems, a couple of players that have bad handling, and overall they're really not good at penetrating to the basket on a drive either. So I think the weaknesses really are just kind of breaking through coverage and being able to do it for long periods of time. Otherwise, a top 8 candidate for sure. And I still think they're going to stay on the list. Bridgeport's another bot team with a 128. And it looks like they have a decent crop of bigs, even though their skills aren't quite there. You have Freeman, Jones, Pringle, kind of their top three. You have Hector Farias and Jeremiah Armstrong as kind of round out players as far as the top 4 or 5 bigs go. But once you get down to Armstrong, you're kind of in a bad way. I don't think you can foul through 2 or 3 players on the big side, though. I think at best you can get both bigs out and still be okay. So while they have the height, again, I don't know if they have the skills inside. So we'll see if that hurts them. I think the biggest issue for me actually is that I just don't see defense. I see, the top 2 defenders are both basically small forward style defenders where they have good inside defense and perimeter defense. Munoz has good inside defense and rebounding and shooting, but doesn't have the height to really go into the power forward or center position, so he's kind of stuck at the small forward with a 4 perimeter defense. And then you have a 5 on maybe their top point guard because they don't have a lot of good passing. So really, of all the teams so far, this is the first one where I question how they've gotten so high up on the list. Because in terms of their talent, player by player, they just aren't there. Certainly makes it real hard to pick them as a contender. All right, Stevenson Mustangs, Klingen. Oops, we've once again decided to skip over the team power index of 150.7. So their seeding versus their TPI suggests that they're underperforming just a little bit. But maybe it just has to do with playing maybe a soft schedule or maybe a soft conference. I think also at first glance it has to do a little bit with the size because I really only see 2 players at essentially 6'4.5" or greater height. So they're stuck playing some guards in the power forward position. And I think if that's what I see here, then that explains why they're kind of underperforming. They definitely have guard talent. There's no doubt about that. A team trying to beat them outside player versus outside player is probably losing a good portion of those battles. They have multiple guys that have good passing. In fact, no fewer than 4 guys could make it as a passer, as a point guard, with Nelson being the only one that obviously won't make it because of his lower IQ and handling. That combo is pretty devastating to try and get to the top of the point guard depth chart. But otherwise, 2 top tier perimeter defenders, 2 decent perimeter defenders, and 3 decent enough inside defenders, although McQueen really can't play there that often. Rebounding seems like the biggest eyesore to me right now. You only have 1 guy that's in double digits. You have a couple that are at 9s, but it's mostly the guards that have it. So this team's essentially slugging it out with people and making good use of players with significantly good passing ratings and a good handful of players that have good handling. And unlike some of the teams that we just looked at before them, directly before them specifically, they have guys that can finish and drive. So in terms of getting away from coverage, they seem to do a good job of that. And that might be what makes them so capable, we'll say, of putting up points. As we can see from their conference standings, they're doing well enough defensively, but more importantly, they're slaughtering everybody offensively. Looks like only 1 team is even close to them, and it's a team that is the worst, arguably, defensively in their conference. WPI, still a bot team. It was once a prominent controlled team, but looks like they have been without one for a while. 134.1 on the TPI scale. The first thing I notice is they have at least one injury that will carry over into tournament play. Markovic, their 7-foot center, is not going to be playing in the first couple of games, so they'll have to get by without him. But they certainly have enough height, even if it's not really the skill set height. It's definitely the pure height. Narvaez, Presley, Graham, Chin, and Markovic are all at a level that I would be comfortable playing inside in League 6. The bigger obstacle for me is that they almost have to go a smaller lineup to get the good inside defense because their 3 inside defenders are Chin at an 11. He's a big height, so he's clearly in a good spot. But then you have a 6'6" and a 6'6.5" that are your only other 2 good inside defenders. I think Hilton is probably their power forward by default, and I think the computer makes the wise choice there because he's got the 14-13-10 combo in terms of the big 3 inside skills of inside shooting, rebounding, and interior defense. Randall, on the other hand, isn't quite as good on the rebounding and the inside shooting front, but at least has the inside defense to kind of play off the bench for them if needed. Otherwise, I think Markovic is probably the player that they relied on to kind of be the 3rd or 4th rotation big, given that he has decent enough ratings. But you can see why he's basically a 1-star player. He, despite having good height, just doesn't have a double digit anywhere in the big 3 stats. So I love the height, don't really love the stat lines. So I think that they could go in and fight against a team with 135 to 140 bigs and come out on the short end of the stick. Colorado State, another bot team at 138.5. So at first glance, they have a couple of guards playing in the small forward position, looks like. But they really have some good perimeter defenders. Their top 3 at the guard height level are Eldridge, Boykin, and Barber, and they all 3 have 12+ perimeter defense. They don't quite have the same threat inside with a 10 and 11, and then it's just a dramatic fall off. I'm going to guess Wing is probably somebody in contention to get some minutes down low because of his 12 inside shooting and his 14 rebounding. But he can be exposed given that he's A, going to not move at all up and down the court with that 3 speed. And B, even if he's parked inside, there's no guarantee he's going to defend it well given he's only got a 5 value there. So he's really reliant on just being good at reading the rebounding situation and making good use of his inside shooting. It's a very, very, very good veteran group of guards, though. It's very clear how they've gotten here. I think the only weakness I see amongst their guards is that maybe one of them has bad speed. Otherwise, it's just a question of whether or not their 4th best player for the rotation of, say, 5 players is going to be good enough. I mean, you're going to be picking between probably Dale Kenny and Darren De La Rosa. I suppose Beckwith can play well enough as a point guard, but I definitely see some issues once they get through the top three guys. So maybe a situation where they get eliminated before the top eight just because they don't quite have the depth defensively. Strider and the Massachusetts Minutemen. Let's see where they're at. Got a 131.7. So they have decent depth across the board. I see enough guys that are kind of the 6'7" height and above to make a good top three defensively there. You're really 6'6.5" if it's got enough wingspan vertical, which this player has a 7 foot plus wingspan and a 33.5 inch vertical, so plus and plus. I think there's a solid group of four down low. And even their fifth guy, who's not quite at the greatest of heights, has good inside shooting and good inside defense. On the perimeter, they don't have a superstar defender, but they definitely have a whole bunch of guys that could qualify as decent defenders in the 10 to 12 range. So the only major question marks I have for this team really come from will they generate enough offense, because it looks like they've built their team around team defense as opposed to team offense, given that a lot of their perimeter shooters are kind of in the 10 to 13 range for the outside shooting. And even their interior guys are shooting mostly 10s and 11s. It's just Edgar Borges at 6'6" and not quite the wingspan for the power forward position. He's the only guy that's really good at shooting inside, and I'm going to say that he's probably better served as a small forward. I would say this is a situation where I would point out that they really aren't redshirting some of their players that aren't getting significant minutes. I think if they want to kind of push some of these guys that are kind of lower end talents, a guy like a Lloyd Foley should be in position to get a red shirt this year, which he is not. I think you have to weigh your options though once you get down to your guys that are playing 6 or 7 minutes. I certainly would advocate for guys down at that level of talent to get their red shirts in. So, quick glance now that we've gotten through seeds 1 through 5 projected so far, to kind of look at the TPI score. And you're looking at the teams that are performing at the best of the best levels. So, looking at basically the top 20 teams in League 6 or Division 3 basketball. It's not even enough to cover all 32 leagues yet. And you're seeing mostly guys that are in the 120s, the 130s, and the 140s. If we go ahead and look at Division 2 and look at TPI there, you'll notice that there are a lot of teams in the 150s and the 140s at this late stage. But then in comparison, the Division 3 falls off to the 140s almost instantly, and even once you get down to the top 50s, we're looking at 130s. So at minimum, I hope we can see that there's a little bit of a talent gap between levels. And I'm going to refer to this again at the very end when we go over some tips for getting out of Division 3 and kind of matching up with these teams that are in the tournament. But for now, let's go ahead and look at Western State, Colorado. It's another bot team. We'll go ahead and start scrolling down towards the end. Maybe. All right. So it's a bot team with a 135.9. It's a bot team that's got a lot of red shirts on its underclassmen, so that's kind of interesting. But we definitely see a couple of problems with this team. They're slightly undersized. They definitely have the depth amongst the undersized guys to make out a good rotation of 4 players that can play big for them, but they also are not so talented that they can't get exposed by someone that's playing a couple inches taller. So again, if you got like a 6'10.5" in the 120s versus a 6'7.5" in the 120s, most of the time, as long as the build isn't really crazy, the guy at 6'10 is going to win out a little bit. What is good for this bot team, though, is some of their guys that are kind of on this iffy height level have good inside shooting and or good rebounding and or good inside defense. So they have a good complement of the 3 big skills across at least 3 of the 4 guys that have the height to play there. For the guard side, they have really, really good perimeter defense in their top 3. So I see a lot of struggles forthcoming for teams that have to run into them because they have a 15, and an 18 that they can play between point guards, shooting guard, and small forward and just dominate. Defensively, at least. And even offensively, they aren't too bad either. It looks like their big issue actually is if they play a slower style of game offensively, they're going to find they just can't do it. They don't have the crazy speed burners outside of Little as far as their top 3 guard options go. I don't know. It's a really interesting team because it's not really the type of team that you go, wow, they've got a lot of skills. But man, some of these guys do have their skills in the right areas. It's really the only difference between a lot of these players and teams with slightly higher skill indexes is that there's passing and handling on those lineups. So I think this is one of those teams where you could probably turn it into a 20 to 25 turnover situation if you wanted to be able to take them out. And I think that's eventually what's going to eliminate them before they get into that top 8. Kiwi has Defiance Yellow Jackets at 131.9. Let's take a look. Well, the first major issue I see, and probably they already know this is coming, but what little height they have doesn't quite have the defense for the inside defense. And even the perimeter is kind of lacking there as well because there's only 2 guys in the low double digits. They don't have any great defenders out there. A lot of guys are just on the fringe between single and double digits. So they've got guys that can come in and play reasonably well enough if they can shoot, which most of them can. Seems like a lot of these guys have great range and then also enough outside shooting, at least on 3 of them, to really take advantage of that. And they definitely have at least one big that's going to be a tower in Edward Manning with the 13 and 13 on the inside and rebounding. But again, I think this is one of those teams where if they don't shoot well in a given day, they're done because they don't have enough defense to really slow anybody down. In fact, if we look at them, they are a conference leader, but you can tell it's all offense based on their 85.6 points for per game. Nobody else outside of Wisconsin and Whitewater have a value in the 80s there. And defensively, they aren't in the top 3 or 4 teams. They're very much a middle of the road at best team. So we got Player 071 has the Whitman College Blues at a 139.6. Decent skill index. Let's see if it's because of just being guard heavy. A little bit, but not terribly. They have some guys that are down there at the upper one teens, both of them at 117 actually, that are both big height and both do at least something right down there. I mean, 17 inside shooting alone with a 9 inside defense is probably enough for Ethan Schuler to be a threat inside. Scarborough has the 12 rebounding, 12 inside defense, so he's pretty good down low. And then you have 2 guys in the 140 to 150 range that have enough height to play power forward or the center position. And again, one of them looks to be the better shooter with enough inside defense to get by, while the other one looks like he's the stud rebounder with inside defense and just doesn't have quite the same level of shooting. What I find quite interesting about this team is they actually have a speed advantage inside because not a lot of teams are going to have double digits on both their power forward and their center. Most teams sacrifice it at the center. As far as our guard players go, I think the biggest weakness they have really is perimeter defense because I'm looking at passing and I don't see too many bad passers amongst their top talents. There are a couple of bad players as far as handling goes, but they don't seem to be that common. It looks like actually just their center amongst their top handful. Amongst their bigs, enough of them have good strength to get by. At least their starters do. Their backups don't have the best of strength, but if they're only going to play, a combined 20 to 5, maybe even only 20 minutes, then that should still be good enough. And more importantly, as we've noted, there's a lot of teams that play 6'7", 6'6" guys at power forward. Come in with a 6'10", that isn't the strongest in the world. He might still be strong enough to outmuscle some of those smaller guys. So I put an asterisk here as I think that this is one of those teams that could kind of minor upset their way into a top 8 spot. Although as a 6 seed, it's not really that big of an upset. USC Upstate is bot controlled. And again, as per the norm with bots, is they can't really get all the best recruits, so their skill index number is a little bit low at the 132.7 range. This team really has no chance, though, for my money, because they don't have a big. Their best guy as far as big goes is a sub triple digit SI guy. And he might actually be playing significant minutes for them now that I'm looking at their team. Yep, he is. So they're resorting to having to play a guy that had 84 skill index to start the season at center. And yet here they are, a top 6 seed. And I think they're doing it strictly because they've got a good perimeter game. Not so much shooting, but in terms of defense, again, they have enough guys up there that can double-digit defend. They've got 2 really good defenders, in fact. And a couple more to complement them. However, this team is no threat whatsoever to get into the top 8 in this Division 3 tournament, simply because I don't see enough inside defense or rebounding or even inside shooting in a lot of situations here. And they don't have the height either to match up with some of these teams. And if you look, they've actually made themselves out to be a top 2 team and basically tied the best team in League 6.5. But if you look, the top 3 teams in point differential are not the top 3 teams here. So they simply just got to the point where they outplayed some of their opponents well enough to get into a promotion spot. Just kind of looking down at the teams down there. Yeah. So they beat teams that had slightly more skill index, which is kind of common for bots to do that, but I feel like bots have the unfair advantage of kind of having some of the understanding of some of the hidden traits that we know exist. So maybe they're good at recruiting players that are lower ranked. All right, the last 8 teams is where we're at now. University of Detroit Mercy, owned by ADCGM. Kind of wondering if that's an old buzzer beater guy, because we had a guy over there with the same ADC name. But anyways, 143.5, so pretty good skill index for being down at this level of seeding. It looks like there is a guy that's going to be pushing an injury into the first couple of tournament games. Thankfully, it's not at a critical position of power forward or center, because they don't have the height really to kind of match up well down low. It looks like they're playing mostly a 6'4.5" guy at power forward, just because the inside defense that he has is the second best on the team. Their center's fine down low, but again, it looks like basically a 2-man front court, and their third option is maybe the 6'5.5" Danny Small that's kind of built more like a guard ish. So definitely can see where the weak point of this team is. And you can definitely see where the strength is, because you got, 7 guys that have double-digit perimeter defense. 4 guys with 13 plus. Their best defender and their biggest matchup issue is again hurt, so that's kind of unfortunate. I think that might actually be just enough to put them in a bad spot for the top 8. It really depends on what game he comes back for. I think they have a good enough seed where they're going to go against a team that they're going to be able to match up well against. I think the combination of him kind of being hurt for the first game or two, plus the fact that they don't have great inside defense, I think that combo is enough for me to say no. And if they do manage to go up to the next level, by the way, they're going to be in a world of hurt, because they don't have a lot of underclassmen left. This is a senior or bust year, so. See what happens. All right, UC Santa Barbara. 139.8. Let's see what Dime has to work with here. We're starting to see a fall off on height now that we're getting down to these seeds. So we're seeing how some of these bots have won now. We're seeing guys that don't have height beyond their center position. Darius Lyles is the only guy that's truly big height. They have guys that can play down there that are kind of in the 6'5" or 6'6" range. The other issue this team has is they just don't have a lot of scholarship players on their depth chart, so they're going to, in some games, rely on some of their eighth or ninth guys that are playing 5 or 10 minutes a game. Some of the walk-ons with single digits, so that's a small concern. Clearly, their guards are good enough, though. What's crazy, just kind of looking around at some of their smaller bigs, is Dylan Thomas doesn't necessarily have the greatest height, but he has a decent enough wingspan, and he certainly is a strong player. Very close to that magical 20 number. And their team is certainly fast enough across their top 8. I mean, 8 guys, double digits all. So kind of one of those situations where I go, hey, look, if you're a team in this level, this is the kind of team that's going to be playing in a spot to promote and to play in the national tournament. And yet we can look at this team and see some of the weaknesses. Despite the weaknesses on this team, though, I mean, you could make a case for them making the top 8 just because they have a couple of things they do really well. If I were to kind of advocate for building a team out of the lower leagues, I would say pick something to do really well and maximize on it. And what they've done is they've maximized on players that have good perimeter defense and guys with high end driving and speed that can play good up tempo. Not all of them can shoot great from the outside, but a lot of them can shoot well enough from the inside. And they all have great finishing, actually, amongst their top 5 players. So they do the little things right on this build and put themselves in a position to compete in the tournament. And once you're in there, all you got to do is win a couple of games in a row to get to the Elite 8. So while I might not pick them this time, there's certainly enough there to where if they made the top 8, you wouldn't be questioning it too much. Indiana Hoosiers, run by Said at a 132.7 skill index. And looks like the reason why they're at where they are at, I'm going to guess it's probably because of their big situation. I can see 3 players that are clearly big height. I can see a 4th guy that could sneak into the equation and play as a big. But unlike the last team, they've relied more on inside and outside shooting ratings and not having great finishing. The players that do it all are the players that are really the monsters. So I would look at this team and actually say that even though they have way better shooting grades and you would think they're way better shooting, in reality, only a handful of them have the driving to make up for the fact that their finishing is a single digit number. Other than that, I don't see anything that screams at me that this team can't compete to get close to a top 8. It's just a question of whether or not some of their smaller players that kind of get forced into playing minutes at big will be a detriment to their ability to get there, especially if some of their bigs fell out. I'm not nearly as concerned on the guard side. They have enough depth into the 1-teens to the 120s. They have good perimeter defense. They have enough shooting. Most of them have enough speed. They have a good point guard. So, it's really close to the point where you just say that they're potentially good enough to make it there. I think if there's a team that's going to fringe out, it's going to be them, because we have 1, 2, 3 that are definite yeses, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we were to list a top 8, they would be 8th right now on that top 8, and we still have teams left to go. GAC is next. Vorticity, 134.3. All right, let's look, see what they've put together to get into the tournament. It looks to me like it's all on the perimeter. They have some decent shooting from some of their big height players, but they don't have great rebounding on those big height players outside of Cornet. And furthermore, their interior defensive grades are all single digits. They basically have no guy that can shut you down inside. So immediately that's the reason why they can't be a top 3 or 4 seed in the tournament. They just didn't have enough inside defense to be competitive down low. Instead, it looks like they've decided that they're going to run kind of the crazy good guard lineup out there and see if they can just outskill you with their guard setup. I think their efficiency should be good enough because they have both a power forward and a point guard that can distribute fairly well. It's one of the rare teams that I'm looking at that doesn't have a lot of good IQ players in their starting 5, especially on their guard side. You always have some small concern with a 5 IQ on any kind of guard, but since he's a small forward and B has 16 handling, I think that makes up for some of it. My personal opinion is if you have low IQ, you have to have at least decent handling so that even if you're making bad decisions, you're not turning the ball over when you make the good decisions. But yeah, I see 1, I see 2, I see 3 guys that have enough height to play in a big position. 1, 2, 3, 4, excuse me. But one of those 4 has a 5 on interior defense, and another one has a 4. And both of those guys have singular rebounding. So, no, I'm sorry. There's no real way for me to kind of put this team as a top 8 team. They did good to get through into the tournament. They did good to get into their top 3. But they'll find that once they get up to Division II basketball, it becomes a little bit trickier to play such a small lineup. Looks like Humboldt just lost their human charge. It's always sad to see. So a couple things stand out to me. They only have 7 scholarship players. So you automatically look at this team and you say, well, their depth is going to be a small issue. They don't really have the best of size. They have a couple of guys that are kind of smaller guys that are good in terms of their skill set. Edkins has the good height in terms of his wingspan and vertical, but doesn't have the height otherwise. If he was only a couple inches taller, he would be considered very capable with the wingspan that's +5 on his height and the vertical that's over 30. But I think the 15 inside shooting, the 15 rebounding, and the 12 inside defense is enough to punish somebody if he were to play, say, a power forward instead of a center for the most part. I think there are situations where he can come out on top there. I think the big issue outside of height would be that they don't really have a lot of guys in this top 7 that have great stamina. They're all single digits. Normally, stamina is not a huge deal because you have a couple of guys here and there that can't play big minutes. You have to cover them with other players. But when you only have 7, kind of makes that a bit trickier. So they probably will have a lot of fatigue issues. Their top 7 is all very fast. And they tend to all have, for the most part, good handling. Of the 7, 6 of them have 9 or greater. Only one of them has kind of poor handling. The other issue I see in this top 7, though, is just overall defense. There's 2 guys in there with 7s or less in both interior and perimeter defense. So those 2 players are going to get kind of exposed when they get on the court. And for that reason, I think that take that with the height issues, and we have enough here that they can't finish top 8. In fact, the fact that they are actually up in the top 3 teams is a little bit of a interesting scenario. It looks like it's just Conference 6-9 is one of those conferences that just doesn't have enough managers in place to have the talent to be able to knock them out of the top 3. All right, we're down in the 120s with this. Glenville has a 129.1. They have all their scholarships pretty much filled. They just don't have a lot of skills across those players. Even if I were to kind of piece together, let's see. Perimeter defense-wise, they have 2 players that can defend well enough. One of them's at a big height, so you almost have to play him more as a small forward, maybe? And then they only have 2 interior defenders. So yeah, I see a lot of height and a lot of guys that are close on the inside defense at least to maybe be passable. But this is another example of a team that you would have to beat to promote. And I think this is maybe a really good example of a situation where teams tend to overthink what they actually need to do to be able to promote out of one of these conferences in Division 3 basketball. Is you basically need 3 guys that are in the 140s, and you need probably 3 guys that have enough height and some sort of decent skill set to match up down low. And really, you don't even need that, because this team, if you look, they have 4 guys at that level of 6'8" or above, we'll say. But 2 of them are upperclassmen that are just now getting into the 1-teens. So you don't even need like a top big. You could take like an 85 or an 80 or 75 SI big and just play him enough minutes, and he would automatically catch up to these guys. So your depth chart doesn't have to be filled with these superstar 4-star players or 5-star players to get out of this level. all you really need to do is have a starting five that kind of is in the 130 to 140 range, and you're already competitive enough to beat up on one of the teams that's in the tournament as a 7 or 8 seed. So just food for thought there. Anyways, Glenville definitely wouldn't get a top 8. Baxter and the Polar Bears, 138.4. So a couple of things to note here. They have 5, 6, 7 guys with 10 plus perimeter defense, but only one that's good enough on the interior. However, one of their bigs that only has 7 inside defense has very good inside shooting and great rebounding. So there's a trade-off there. At least there's 2 areas where that second big that doesn't have great inside defense has some really killer stats in 2 of the other important areas to make it where he's probably going to be passable. I mean, let's just look at Hilton just for the sake of argument here. Yeah, at this level, he's shooting a really high percentage, averaging 10.5 field goal attempts, making 7 of them on average. And his field goal percentage to opponent's field goal percentage is basically a plus 16. Despite the fact that he will never be a good interior defender at a 7 inside defense, he's got such efficient offensive production because he has good inside shooting. And his rebounding is so high that he does so much for the team that it doesn't even matter. Like, this is one of those teams where I would actually just commit. Even though they're not really a top 3 or 4 team, I think this is one of those easier picks to go for a potential top 8 so long as one of their bigs doesn't get hurt. Because their top 2 bigs are very good. Their third option is not stellar by any means, but he's a passable guy to have. Their fourth option is where it gets a little bit iffy. I couldn't stomach starting Murphy at any point. Maybe Summers would sneak in before Murphy, though. In any event, they have enough height there, that's fine. They have enough perimeter defense. The only real weakness they have is their perimeter shooting's kind of meh. They're a team reliant on getting good finishing players that have mostly single to low double digits in terms of their inside or outside shooting. They have guys with good range, and they have good inside threats. So as long as they can get it into the inside threats, they're safe. I don't know, if an 8 seed can be considered a dark horse to make a tournament run, I think this is one of those teams. So, one to keep your eye on. Finally, Middle Tennessee State Blue Raiders. This is one of the stronger bot teams in terms of their skill indexes, 143.5. So I'm going to guess that it has something to do with height. Let's see. Their height is 6'8.5", 6'6.5", 6'7", and nothing else. So they have 3 guys. But otherwise, I don't see a massive issue with this team, actually. Just kind of looking at a glance, they have guys that can rebound. Maybe not across all their big positions, but their small forward option has a 14. They have a 13 on one of their bigs. The bigs that can't rebound well have double-digit inside defense. While their team isn't great handling on the inside, all of them have good passing still, so it seems like they should be able to send balls back out to the perimeter whenever they get in a situation down low. Some of their bigs also lack driving, which is a small concern. I kind of like having a guy that can drive the basket that's big, but it's not necessary all the time. I don't know. I'm actually going to go ahead and give out another yes here because I see enough here to where they could be another dark horse to kind of make the late tournament run. So I think that would probably eliminate Indiana from the discussion. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys that I've given a yes to a top 8. And then these 4 here with the asterisks. Whitman, Northwestern, St. Paul, Louisiana Tech, SUNY, Canton would be the other 4 that I would kind of consider for the top 8 run. It's not to say anybody else that's in this list can't make one. It's just the teams I've outlined are the teams that I think have enough put together across the board to make it happen. So in the last 15 to 20 minutes here, I'm going to make a couple of different points again. The first is we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 of the top 32 teams in the tournament have a 140 TPI score or greater for their team. So you don't need a team of superstars to compete with these guys. You may struggle against the top of the top there. But again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's even more than that. There's 36 teams. There's basically enough for one in every conference. And that's it at the 140 level or greater. And at the start of the year, those levels are going to be even lower. I would bet that at the start of the year, there's probably only 17 teams that made a top TPI of 140 or greater. And maybe only one team that was above 150 at the start of the year. So the biggest misconception is you need to get all of these great talented players to get your way out of this level. I would consider it the biggest mistake to go after a 4 or 5 star player because you simply don't need it. Would you need it if you were in, say, Division 1, Conference 3 point something? Maybe. At that point, I would consider going after a guy. I might consider going after a 4 star as soon as, say, Conference 5 or Conference 4. You start recruiting and hoping that you make it up to Division 1 and you start recruiting the 4 stars to kind of get in there at that point. But I think a lot of the teams that struggle to get out of these lower leagues, I think they tend to focus too many of their points in one basket going after some of these top players. Another common misconception, and something I see asked on the forum from time to time, is do my contacts hold any value once I get to very high on a player? I look at the comments of a recruit as far as where they're at. Excuse me, this is the wrong page. But when I go in and look at the uncommitteds, when I see the interest levels here, I look at it as an indicator of how many contacts it takes to get to each level. All the comment does is it just indicates to you how many contacts it takes to get to each level. It's just kind of the indicator. It's not a end all be all. So just because a interest level gets to high or very high, that has no bearing on where it starts or stops as far as the value of your contact goes. It's just that there's no other benchmark above very high for you to look at. If Steve were to put into the game very high plus plus and put extremely high above that and put a couple more pluses, then maybe you would see growing interest levels still. But the only thing that you don't see anymore once you get to very high is the growing interest. You don't have a physical, tangible proof that you're gaining value on the player at the same level or the same stages as you're going up. So do not assume that it means that your contacts are now worthless, because that's not what it means. It just means that you can't see them growing anymore. So that's the second misconception I commonly see. The third common misconception I see is questions regarding strategy, game tactics. And the reason I consider it a misconception is because if we go back and look at the teams that we were pointing out, you notice how a lot of them have no president? A lot of these teams that are in the top are playing base tactics. They're playing basic management and tactics and winning. While you need to start learning some strategies and such once you get into, say, Conference 4 and Conference 3 and the Division 1 level, it means almost nothing at this level. You can make up some skill differences, but if a bot team can come in and manage with basic tactics and beat out human teams, even with inferior SI scores, then that means tactics really can't have a huge impact on whether or not you can escape. So at best, it gives you a chance to get a couple wins you shouldn't get. So if you're looking for sound strategies, I would say the only thing that you really need to focus on, in my opinion, is looking to reduce some of the shooting from players that can't shoot well. I think that's the only thing that I would say that anybody in Division 3 really needs to know is if you've got a guy that doesn't have shooting, at least knock him down a level so that he doesn't shoot as often. Maybe you could go through and go to the management page and decide, well, I want this guy with his 15 IS and 5 outside shooting at a guard position to shoot mostly from inside the arc. So I'm going to make him shoot with a big eye or a small eye or something. Those kind of decisions you should make just by looking at each and every player that you have on your team. But anyways, I think that's just basic management. I don't think you have to go crazy with picking up zones or man-to-man or trying to find some sort of crazy tempo to play based on what your opponents play or any of that. That might get you some small victories here and there at best. So I would say focus more on recruiting first and picking up your strategies thereafter. If I were to give any advice on recruiting without going to the recruiting page and just pointing at players, because I know that some people don't like that, so I'm not going to do it. But if I were to give you some advice for recruiting at Division 3, after telling you not to go after 4 or 5 stars yet, my advice would be this. You have the unique ability to recruit a player that a top team cannot recruit. And what I mean by that is if you're playing at in say Division 1, let's go to Division 1 real quick. If you look at just the top 50 teams in terms of their RPI, the worst team in the top 50 is at a 142. And a bulk of them are at 150s. If you go strictly to TPI, the lowest you go is 153. If you compare that to Division 3, there's only one team in Division 3 that's at 153 or more. One. So they have to recruit a higher base of a player to be able to play starting minutes for them. So most of them cannot recruit a guy that starts in the 70s or 80s. So your advantage really to be had is that you can recruit the players that have decent enough growth, if that's something you look at, and have decent enough ratings in key areas that you can play them as freshmen, where all these teams cannot. So I'm just going to go down here on this side. Let's go player A, player B. And let's say this player is owned by a D6 team, and this one is owned by a D3 team. If they both start at 90, most of the time both will redshirt. Assuming a standard growth rate, most redshirt guys go somewhere between 7 and 15 SI growth. So let's just go with 11 because that's kind of in the middle of all that. They would both get to 101. A Division 3 team with a skill index 101 player can't really start them ever. Even if they have injuries, this guy's at best a fifth on the depth chart player. So if you think about it, he's only going to get 10 minutes. In most situations, 10 minutes is about his cap. So his growth rate's going to be stunted by the fact that he can't get all those minutes. So he might only gain another dozen skill index. Whereas in 6, a 101 is starting to become fringe for the top 7 depth chart. So a lot of the times, especially if you take over a team that has no talent, really to begin with, like you may pick a team and they may only have 4 scholarship players. You can start that player or at least give them 20-ish minutes a game. And once you give them those minutes, their growth rate accelerates. So instead of just getting a dozen skill index, suddenly they get 18 to 20. So this 101 might turn into a 119 to 122. Player B on this team that's at a higher level at 113 still can't really play. He's probably again going to maybe move up to 7th and 8th on the depth chart and maybe get to a position where he moves just a little bit quicker, but not by much. Whereas now in Division 6, at a 120, you're starting to get to the 6th man or the 5th starter on your team. He's now certainly going to get a lot more minutes, probably going to get in the 25 to 30 range. And if he's at 120-ish, we'll say, the chances of him getting to 140 there are high. So again, this is out of high school. This is after a red shirt. This is a redshirt freshman year, redshirt sophomore year. These are the endpoints of those. So you can see that you've now probably gained 10 to 15 SI on a player that hasn't gotten enough minutes to really get all of their skill. Now it gets a little tricky because at this point, it's a question of where you recruit the player in terms of their potential. In terms of an 11 potential, nothing will really change. Most of the time, the juniors will slow down a little bit, so even if they both start by some chance, we'll say they both gain at about the same rates from here on. If you're at a 10 potential, 155 is probably a little bit high. You're probably going to see a guy at 152, 153 at the highest, and more likely right at 150. The difference between this game and Steve's first game, which is Broken Bad, is they can't exceed by a little margin their potential. So a potential is not like a brick wall that can go north of it. I could probably give you about 60 examples of players that have exceeded their potential, especially in the 10 and 11 range. And that's without really trying that hard. So by the senior season, we'll say they're somewhere between 150 and probably 165. And this player is probably looking at 150 to 165, depending on his growth rate. So they both at the end get to the same point. But I would say these years right here, this player really can't play for this team. Whereas over here, in the worst case scenario, you have a guy that has to bench for 3 and can start for 3. Whereas over here, you have probably only a senior starter. So that's the reason why you can recruit a player that really doesn't have a high start point, but can get to a higher end point. And thus you can make that asset work a lot better for you than the teams that are higher up. And that's why you see players going really late into the recruiting season in kind of the 70 to 85, 90 range without a whole lot of offers on them, because they don't get the offers because the teams that are in Division 6 tend to over-recruit a little bit from what I've seen. And the teams that are in Division 1 basketball simply can't really afford to recruit too many of those players. They have to chase some of the guys that have closer to the 100 skill index when they come in. Unless they have some crazy growth rate in high school. I've seen some guys with 20 growth rate in high school that just tend to accelerate ridiculously despite having no minutes, and then they can suddenly become good players by the time they get to their sophomore year. So, anyways, the point here is that you can get more mileage out of a player that somebody else can't even recruit. So don't be afraid to go after some of these guys that aren't hotly contested. It's not because they're bad, it's just because they can't be used as efficiently by someone down the road, in Division 1. So hopefully we've knocked out a couple of the misconceptions, and hopefully you enjoyed some of the breakdowns of the top 32 teams in the tournament. There's certainly more than 32 teams in the tournament. Sorry that I couldn't really go north of 2 hours with this video. Would love to break down all 64 teams, but we're not even to the point where we know where all 64 teams are going to come from, because a lot of those come down to the conference tournament winners stealing a few spots sometimes. When some of the lesser teams make these magical runs, they can steal a spot. And certainly some of the fringe teams can get some conference wins or not get them and go from being in to on the bubble to potentially out, depending on how many teams make those magical runs. So thanks for watching. I might have enough time to get through and do a little bit of the same thing in Division 2, but I focused so much on Division 2 with the last video, I wanted to give some time and some effort to the teams that are down here so that you know kind of what to look for and maybe build your way out. So good luck to you, and we'll see you next time.